We are parents, teachers, and educators, and like you, we're passionate about restoring our culture for Christ. This is Veritas Vox, the voice of classical Christian education.
Hello again. Welcome. You've joined us for Veritas Vox, another episode. And this is Veritas Vox, the voice of classical Christian education. Today, we have with us John Stonestreet, probably known to many of you as the president of the Colson Center for Biblical Worldview, or Christian Worldview, and the host of Breakpoint, focused on worldview, apologetics, and cultural issues. Does that describe what you do pretty well, John?
Oh, pretty much. Yeah. I mean, I think that's good. And we had a whole internal debate about whether the best nomenclature was biblical worldview or Christian worldview. And it probably, that choice of language probably means more to us than it does to anyone else. And it's, but no, yeah, you're in the ballpark. Good enough.
Well, as it relates to those terms, my vote is for about 98% synonym. That they're
well, no, that's right. I mean, unfortunately, Christian doesn't always mean biblical. But hey, man, biblical doesn't always mean biblical these days either.
No, and biblical doesn't always mean Christian.
No,
so
that's
there are
right.
lots of problems if you want to pick at it, but I think that it's understood. But we like to start with learning about who you are. So a little bit of background, family, education, career path, and that sort of thing.
Yeah, Sarah and I have been married for over 20 years. Our oldest is a freshman in college. We have 4 children. Abigail, Anna, and Allie were our 3 girls. And then we had an 8-year gap and a little boy. So Abigail, Anna, Allie, and Hunter. So we have both a college freshman and a first grader, which is, we say, if you're going to have a surprise little boy, near when you're too old, to do it, then have some teenage girls in the house. That was a pretty amazing experience. They were homeschooled. We chose homeschooling, and really, what's happened in Colorado is as politically left as this state has become on social issues. Some work was done to really kind of shore up educational freedom, and there was a lot of educational options that were invented and imagined here. I've said this before. I mean, I just think that right now we have kind of a golden age of educational innovation. Some good, some bad, some really good. And so we just had a lot of options. So we went with a lot of hybrid options growing up, but definitely a classical approach for us.
Wonderful.
Yeah. Oh, well, absolutely. I mean, listen, I think it aligns best, in my view, with the Christian worldview, in the sense of, let's get the categories down. Let's get reality down. Let's get the unification of the physical world and the spiritual. In fact, it's even a misnomer to say the physical world and spiritual world, as if we're not talking about the same world. I always say that, listen, the world's a lot more like Narnia than it is like anything that Stephen Jay Gould or Richard Dawkins has imagined. And also, anything that kind of the, idealistic Gnostic views imagine as well. And so, yeah, I just think that that approach has been good for us. It's certainly been good for our kids. I mean, look, our oldest is a freshman in college. The evaluation is still to be done, but so far so good.
Yeah. I remember when my oldest was a freshman in college, but it's a distant memory.
Well, listen, I have been being around the homeschool world. I was asked to speak at a lot of homeschool conferences, and I was always really hesitant. I still am, to do things like marriage. Here's how to do marriage, or here's how to, raise your children sort of events. I do think I've got something to offer in terms of, what the Bible says about marriage, what, the role that marriage plays in a society, the long-term impact that is going to manifest in society if we try to redefine or ostracize marriage as the norm. I think I also, can talk about the cultural forces in particular that are coming after our children. But man, I'm no expert. I'm in the middle of this with everyone.
Well, we're going to get into some of that in what you do professionally now. What was your education? Where did you go to school?
I grew up in Northern Virginia, K-12 evangelical, a Christian day school, went to my freshman year, made decisions of where to go to college based on who would let me play basketball there. I know that wasn't a very academic choice, but I wasn't a very thoughtful kid at the time.
We
And
had
what
those things in
happened?
common. I had sports driving my college solution choice too.
Yeah, well, I
I was
mean,
a
look,
golfer though. I was too short and too slow for basketball.
I was too, but I found the place that would still let me play. But I transferred to a college in East Tennessee, an evangelical school, kind of in the Dallas seminary tradition, and had a couple really important mentors that really sparked my imagination in terms of Christianity being thoughtful. And growing up, Christianity was moral. Christianity was passionate. You did
Right.
things for the Lord, but the idea of all of life and all of self in allegiance and loyalty to Christ, that was something that God used some individuals at that college to really spark in me, and then my journey continued from there. But ended
That
up
really
going
gives
to
depth to the term worldview, to think of it that way.
the college was the first college that I know of to have a required worldview class, other than Calvin, probably, which
Okay.
kind of got it from the Dutch Reform folks. This was coming out of a different tradition. Worldview thought kind of went either the route of James Orr, the Scottish, theologian and pastor, or Abraham Kuyper. And they weren't that far apart, but there was, you could tell the difference between a Kuyper and an Orr. And of course, Chuck Colson, who I would later work with and meet and serve under, and who became a hero mentor as well, was definitely in that Kuyper route. My journey was through the Orr route, but it was just an awakening. I mean, I had a required course called Biblical Worldview. I was just, by the way, 2 weeks ago with the guy who taught that, who was a
Isn't
continues
that
to be a
fun to
friend and a mentor.
regroup with people that shaped you? I love doing
Well,
it.
look, I kept two sets of notes in that class. I had a set of notes that I knew I needed to pass the test. I also had a set of notes of things that he said, ideas, new things that I never wanted to forget, because this was just an awakening happening in
That's
that
really
class.
neat. Yeah.
Anyway, I ended up starting at Reformed Theological Seminary, finished at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School.
Which campus did you go to RTS?
Yes.
Which one? Oh,
Well,
okay.
yeah, the answer is yes, because the reason RTS was high on the list, I was moving in a Reformed direction theologically. And also I was already working at the same college where I'd graduated from in various roles. And so the flexibility the RTS had for J-term and summer term classes, mostly Charlotte and Orlando, were the two places. And I would go and do, kind of 3 weeks in a row and, knock out 10 or 12 hours in the summer. But anyway, landed up at Trinity to finish up. And my area of study was really, there was a good bit of theology and church history. Church history became something that I became super fascinated with. But it was the kind of cultural anthropology, sociology, and trying to think about those things and strong, sound theological categories and biblical categories, just given the collision, particularly on what it means to be human. I think I came to really believe that question, what it means to be human, is the central crisis point of of our culture. And of course, it's, the thing that Christianity has the best answer to on the market. So there's wonderful opportunity there, but we're lost on what it means to be human. I mean, it's obvious. When I was thinking about it, we were just talking about abortion and maybe, where we were going to go with bioethics and education. And, some people had really written on, what does it mean to educate as if kids are just brains, or what does it mean to educate as if kids are just cogs in a machine? And of course, the classical approach really pushed back against that, rightly so.
Yeah.
And of course, now we expand it into every area where we have government enforcement of Gnosticism. We have government enforcement of thinking wrongly about the human person, not just in small ways, but in profound ways. We're not just talking about calling right wrong and wrong right. That would be bad enough if we were just morally confused. We're ontologically confused. We don't know what it means to be human or the nature of reality itself, which is why we got to get these categories down with our kids.
Yeah. I couldn't agree more. Would you accept the summary description of who you are and what you do as a cultural apologist? Is that a
Yeah,
reason to pigeonhole you?
I wouldn't hate that. I mean, the Colson Center, because of the life and work of Chuck Colson, and look, I live in Colorado Springs. There's a lot of organizations here
Yes,
who are second generation, third generation, and they really apologize. They spend a lot of time trying to explain away what their founders did or decisions they made, or it's a new day here or something. I don't do that at all. I think Chuck Colson was one of the most profound and important leaders, and where he put us in a trajectory. And of course, we were birthed as part of prison fellowship.
Right.
And that's one of the interesting things. Chuck believed in heart, mind, and hands. He believed that you had to have right thinking and right doing. He was a Wilberforce guy, right? And remember Wilberforce?
I do. I think that's a good parallel to draw.
Well, he wanted that. He emulated that. We still, by the way, award the William Wilberforce Award once a year at our national conference. And it's always has to be someone who's both thought and did. Doesn't mean they can't be an academic, for example, a Professor Robbie George or something, but that those ideas have kind of grown feet and walked out into the real world. But that's Wilberforce, right? Wilberforce famously said God gave him two great aims: the abolition of the slave trade and the reformation of manners. And of course, what he meant was the restoration of virtue and characters. What he meant by manners, not like table manners, like get your elbow off the table. He was
but I want to say something about table manners, because sometimes it's a bad rap in that regard. We have done in the context of the schools that we've started, we've done some significant formal teaching about protocol and manners. And it's not because we're embarrassed by the people and we want to make sure that they behave better. It's because I have come to understand that manners are the way that we love our neighbor by making them feel comfortable in our presence.
I think that's absolutely right. And I think also the teaching of that stuff in that context, if it's framed, if it's explained, is that process of habituation. And of course, that's something that Aristotle rightly understood about the human condition, is that I don't think he got it completely right. I think, Augustine's "we are what we love" is better than "we are what we habitually do."
Right.
But there's an inherent connection between love and habitually do. And you don't love your neighbor if you don't habitually practice loving your neighbor.
Right.
This is my first interaction, by the way. My first employment when I first came on board, and Chuck was still alive. He died in 2012. And I had, been invited into a handful of things with him. And his first big project that I was traveling around speaking with him on and so on was called Doing the Right Thing. It was a curriculum on virtue and virtue formation. It was pretty, more like college level. But that idea of virtue formation became a primary thing because you can't just talk about what the right thing is and expect then people, particularly, and this is the work we do, in a cultural moment where all the water's flowing the opposite direction, suddenly expect them to swim right, and to do it in the right way. Yeah. That habituation is really, really important. That's what we mean, I think. I mean, at least holistic education has to include that.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Tell us, you touch on a lot of different things. I've looked at kind of the list of topics that you've addressed. We're focused substantially on education here. Tell us about your interests and initiatives in education, especially in the K-12 world that we focus on.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we do talk about everything and part of that comes from that Kuyperian, remember that wonderful line from Abraham Kuyper, "There's not a single square inch."
Right.
And in which Christ, Lord over all, mine. And here's what Chuck used to do. He would say, and that means the Christian's job is to go everywhere and say his. And so when we go and talk about these random things, which we do on Breakpoint, from AI to certainly all the sexual issues. I'm so tired of talking about sex, I could scream, honestly. But, you don't always get to choose because of the cultural moment.
Yeah.
But we always want to talk about these things theologically. We want to talk about these things within the framework of what's true about the world,
Yeah.
what's true about the human person, and can mobilize Christians in their calling. So that's how we think about it at the Colson Center: the true story of the world, the true identity of people as made in the image of God, and then the "how now shall we live" question, which of
Yeah.
course began with
Yeah.
Schaeffer, and Chuck edited that adverb there, and I think gave some clarity to it. When it comes to education, man, I'm all in. Now, part of that has to do with my background, having done a lot with Christian schools, K-12 Christian schools and ACSI schools and so on. And of course, predating really the resurgence in classical
Right.
education and the explosion, which we, of course, have taken part in as a family. And then also teaching at an evangelical college for years, being involved in that space. So education is just kind of part of my DNA. I also, before working at the Colson Center, worked at Summit Ministries,
Oh,
which of
sure.
course is trying to help prepare Christian kids for the challenges they're going to face in college on the apologetics and cultural level. But look, what has heightened all of that is the last 3 years. Well, no, wait, 4 or 5 years, really 4 years. I tell Christian schools, you all should all write a thank you note to the Loudoun County School Board for the marketing efforts that they gave on your behalf. We have never been, in my lifetime, in a moment where the state-run system is so vulnerable. Now, look, you can see it because they're doubling down.
Yeah.
You could see it because they're starting to say the quiet thing out loud, like your kids belong to us and not to you. I mean,
Oh,
you have leaders saying that.
Yeah.
And what that means is things are shaky.
Yeah.
Now, look, it's not as shaky as I want it to be. And if we're going to continue to chop away, we're going to have to swing hard, and we're going to have to sharpen our axe. And
Yeah.
so what I think this
It
is
does. I have a
yeah, sure.
parenthetical thought here that I just want to throw into this, and it may be too much of a side road for the time we've got. But the problem with that is when we get people at Veritas in our online school or in a school that we provide curriculum for, that's bricks and mortar school somewhere all over the country, if they're running from something,
Mhm.
they're not as good a person for what we're about as if they're running to something.
Yeah. Well, I don't disagree with that, and certainly you would have that experience in there. My approach is I want 1,000 flowers to bloom. We have chosen the path we have chosen because, we spent a lot of time thinking about it. We chose, differently in some respects than the way both my wife and I were raised, but not holistically, right? I mean, it's in a sense, it's a tweak. It's an important tweak, and probably more than a tweak. That's understating how different it is. But, um, you know, the vision of the human person as seeing education not as transactional, but as the process of creating someone to love what's true and what's good, to learn for the rest of their life.
Yeah.
Um, I think you're seeing more and more in the world of Christian education the necessity to articulate what we're for, not just what we're
And that,
against.
given the opportunity, that is the message, and there's a lot
Yeah.
of buy-in. All I'm saying is the starting point is better if they're not running from, if they're running to.
Well, and that underscores the sort of work we want to do, particularly with teachers. So,
Okay.
our work at the Colson Center with education is not directed completely at classical schools, although we have some of our big school partners are classical schools. I'll be down at one of them, a well-known school in the fall. But
Feel free to name it.
yeah, I have to remember it.
Okay, no problem. Don't
Sorry,
worry.
I mean, it's one that I've been at, or it's kind of one of the ones I hear about is doing wonderful things. I'd have to dig it up in my calendar here. So,
No, don't worry about it.
Trinity,
I thought
Trinity
maybe you
Christian,
weren't saying it
yeah,
for
it's Trinity Christian in Texas.
very good.
So anyway, what we really focus on are two things. Number one is the cultural challenges, and number two is we aim that at teachers. So let me walk through that one at a time. First of all, the cultural challenges. In my work with Summit Ministries as classical education was growing and building, and as the wider world of Christian education was starting to get more focused, and what are we trying to do, not just what are we trying to protect our kids from.
Yeah.
One of the things that emerged that really served classical schools was that how do you take these timeless truths and apply them to the contemporary challenges? Now, part of that had to do with the curricular parts of things, right? Like there was a massive, robust, brilliant homeschool curriculum that was kind of a classical journey through Western Civ. I thought it was great. Robust, way more than I had ever learned, certainly growing up. But we had some parents come and say, that's great. They know all of what the classical thinkers wrote. They know how to distinguish between Aristotle and Plato on these things, but they're not real sure how to apply that to today.
Yeah.
And that's not a problem with the curriculum. The curriculum did what the curriculum can do. And that explains kind of the second part of it.
Sure.
Which is the focus on educators themselves. Now, again, this is something I'm saying about the broader world of Christian education. There's a lot of groups out there putting out really good curriculum. Really good curriculum in the hands of unformed teachers is still a bad class.
Yeah.
And ironically, kind of a bad curriculum, if it's in the hands of a well-formed teacher, that's probably still going to be pretty good.
Yeah.
So the secret sauce, I mean, it's like Chick-fil-A, right? Chick-fil-A has this whole system where they invest in people, not in product, although they keep the product consistent. This is, I think, what an educational world that was running away from the public system didn't always kind of get right, which is teacher formation. Of course, that's complicated by, I think, what is a very real crisis in Christian higher education, and certainly a crisis in higher education in general. So if you're going to hire a teacher from a lot of places, they're not going to be well formed and with an integrative Christian worldview that they can bring to bear on the past, much less on the present, and don't get us started on the future. But that's what a Christian worldview does. It holds those things together. And so our efforts with what we call Colson Educators, it's a free platform for educators, and it's made up of different things. It's an explanation of Christian worldview by walking through, those three facets that I talked about earlier: truth, identity, calling, story of the world, the truth about the human person, and how now shall we live. And also dealing with some really important cultural issues, from the mental health crisis, particularly with teenagers and social media, certainly to all the various issues having to do with sexuality, making claims about, truth claims and arguing for those truth claims. And what does that look like? So the point there is to provide robust formation resources for schools to use with their educators together, to get them all on the same page, to get them moving in the same direction, to serve the direction in which a school is moving. And we've seen about 30,000 educators go through that program in one form
That's
or
wonderful.
another. It is, because it's the secret sauce. I mean, that is like the gift that keeps on giving. You go after a high schooler, you get a high schooler. You go after an important mentor in that high schooler's life, and you're getting a lot more. And
we have said, we can have the best curriculum, we can have the best pedagogy, classical Christian education, but we still haven't addressed the most important thing in education. It's so easy to convince people that that's true, and that is the teacher is the most important part of education. And the reason it's so easy to demonstrate is because all I have to ask is, what curriculum do you remember what you grew up using? What was the educational philosophy that was applied to you? And who are the teachers you remember? You remember the teachers, you don't remember either of the other two.
You don't. That's exactly right. And in fact, you remember the teachers more than anything else. If you remember a class, you remember how bad it was, not how good it was, right? But you remember a teacher, in a different way. That's certainly the case in my life. I mean, you just kind of go through, and it's these incredible individuals who invested in my life, in and out of the classroom too. And of course, that's that whole life sort of approach that parents really have to bring. And, that's the thing that we're doing in our other resources. For example, Breakpoint, daily commentaries. We've spent a lot of real estate in what is a 5-day a week, 5-minute commentary on the culture on this idea of education, but also on the idea of parental rights, because we have a culture across the board that is prioritizing adult happiness over the rights and well-being of children. In education, that takes the form of outsourcing, and then that becomes a norm. And so I forget what I was just in this conversation the other day. Maybe I was speaking somewhere. I can't remember what the context was, but just kind of emphasizing, listen, your kids do not belong to the state. I mean, it's kind of like, gentlemen, this is a football. You remember that line from Vince Lombardi?
Yeah.
He's like,
use it all the time.
NFL team, this is a football.
Vince Lombardi, this was a football, and John Wood and boys, we're going to learn how to tie shoes.
Yeah, it's so true. But that's one of the basics that parents have missed. And part of it is, it's like, the fish that don't know they're wet syndrome. This is the power of culture. That's an unbelievable statement, that the kids belong to the state in other contexts. It has become, it was an unbelievable statement in the American context 100 years ago. So the reason it's so believable and so widely assumed, I remember this is a line often credited to C.S. Lewis, although I haven't been able to find where he said it, but it sounds so much like him. I'm going to think it's him. Where, the most dangerous ideas in a society aren't the ones argued, but the ones that are assumed. And culture's made up of these crashing waves. That's the issues. We all know about those. But there's also the undercurrents that you don't see. Yeah. And the undercurrents are these assumed ideas. And that's one of them. When you separate sex, marriage, and babies as a package deal, and you isolate parents from children, and you elevate sexuality to rights and happiness over and above other rights and happiness, particularly outside relationships, the most important ones with your kids, then it becomes normal to think that, I'm just kind of, it's to shirk that responsibility because it serves adult happiness, which we're told to pursue in every way possible. Yeah. So we just got it all upside down, not just the difference between right and wrong, but we're not seeing reality for what it is. Yeah. And that's why we have to constantly find ways to say, gentlemen, this is a football. Gentlemen, this is a football. Or there's a guy, by the way, if we're talking about lines, you can use this one. There's an old guy in my church in Tennessee. He would say something like that. He'd go, hey man, it ain't rocket surgery. So this is, it ain't rocket surgery, but it is for a lot of people because of our cultural, the shaping of our cultural moment.
Yeah. What advice you have made some real observations. Do you have a couple points of practical advice to offer parents, given the field in which you're playing the game?
Yeah. Well, yeah. Look, the most obvious one, and it's becoming more obvious, thank the Lord, where we even had congressional hearings about this over the past year for the first time, and that's a very big difference from just several years ago where these sorts of things were intolerable, but we're seeing the consequences of this. Look, it's this: get your kids off smartphones. I know that, I grew up in an environment where sometimes, morality was measured not by the heart, but by, the length of a skirt or the length of hair or whether or not you went to the movies and so on. Right. I'm so like rabidly, intentional about not confusing what the Reformed theologians have called structure and direction, right? That the structure was created good and it's the direction that's the problem. But there are structurally evil things that humans can put into the world, or things that are evil up until a point until people have reached some level of maturity, and maybe not even then. And every single indication is that social media through smartphones is a intravenous line of direct poison into our students' hearts and minds.
Wow.
I have just become, it's, I tell Christian school heads this. I say, look, if there was a creepy old guy walking around the campus whispering all bad stuff into the ears of your junior high girls, would you intervene? And they're like, of course. I'm like, okay, that's TikTok. except
Yeah.
it's a whole bunch of creepy old men that are part of the Chinese Communist Party.
Wow.
I mean, look, and mobilized to a whole bunch of other creepy men who are living in the basements at their mom's house, but are just doing awful, 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 awful things. Stop it. It's that old Bob Newhart skit. It's like, I don't know what's causing the problem. Stop it.
Yeah.
Stop it. I love that we have so many shared references here. Stop it on smartphones. You just gotta. This is the Proverbs definition of folly, just how sin makes you foolish.
Yeah.
And it is foolish to give kids unfettered access to the internet, particularly on these social media platforms,
With
without,
so much,
yeah,
boy, the differences in what we know and what we believe about the source. We think of it as an innocuous, independent
yeah,
source, and we see the creepy guy walking around campus. We know that he's not.
yeah, that's right.
But
And
they don't look the
it's
same,
hard.
and we haven't made the connection.
Yeah, and look, I know because I know this is hard. You're for most people, this would be putting the cat back in the bag, right? Now, if you're ahead of the game, good news. Stand strong, agree together. You can get all the data you want if you follow Breakpoint or all the sources on kind of how bad this is. I mean, good heavens, like we all started wearing seatbelts for less of a risk. And that's a good idea. I'm not against seatbelts. I'm just saying there's so many other
It's an
ways.
argument from the lesser to the greater, though. I get it.
Right. That's it. What else practical that I would say? I think this is a non-negotiable right now, is that we need to teach the Bible as a coherent narrative and be very clear on creation. I've got a couple things coming out this next week where we're talking about a really helpful new book from a guy named Edward Klink called The Beginning and End of All Things. And so we're offering that at the Colson Center. You can find out more, or you can just look up that book. What I really like about The Beginning and End of All Things, it's a very clear articulation of the connection between Christianity and redemption. So we talk about the truth about the world in those classic 4 chapters: creation, fall, redemption, restoration. Redemption and restoration are rewords. Re means again. All the words for salvation and the scope and the impact of salvation on individuals and the creation are rewords: renew, restore, redeem, resurrect, repent,
Sure.
reconcile. So we're always being pointed by Paul and the New Testament writers back somewhere. Think about Matthew 19. Jesus is asked about divorce. He's specifically asked about divorce in the Mosaic Law by teachers of the Mosaic Law.
Yeah.
And Jesus says, well, Moses did this, but what's really important is what was true from the beginning. He takes them back to creation to talk about what God really intends for marriage. We have spent about 150 years, and this is the commentaries that are coming out in the next week, talking about creation and evolution, about how God created. Now, listen, this was important. There was a real war happening on ideas. Nothing cemented secularism into the Western imagination more than Darwin, right? I mean, so you got to deal with that stuff.
Yeah.
What we maybe lost track of in the midst of that, and part of that had to do with this kind of what Philip Yancey once called the moral McNugget approach of reading the Bible, where you kind of break it apart for little bits and pieces that you can apply to your life, is the fact that God created the world and the difference that makes.
Yeah.
The idea of creation and all that's implied in Genesis 1 and 2, especially about the human person. So let's fast forward to today. I bet you can go to most churches and say, hey, everybody, fill in the blank. Humans are made in the, and everyone say together, image of God. That's great. Then you say, well, what's that mean? What's the image of God?
Right.
How does the Bible talk about the image of God? Where does the Bible talk about the image of God? What are the implications if we're made in God's image, or if we're animals with a conscience, or computers made of flesh? What difference has the image of God made in human history? By the way, there's been no more consequential idea in human history than that one.
No, that's
Friedrich
right.
Nietzsche said that.
Yeah.
Other than obviously the fact that God created the world and still cares about it. The image of God has become a matter of Christian trivia. But it is one of the most consequential ideas in human history. It is crucial for understanding this cultural moment, and it is a critical aspect of the biblical narrative. So to miss image of God is to miss the real world. And where do you find that? Well, you start where it begins. And so I just think that we have lacked a creation theology. Just this week in Christianity Today, there's an article about this. Unfortunately, the article then looked to theologians who are so deeply influenced by kind of Protestant liberalism that the context of anthropology has to do with, things like climate change and creation care. We haven't even got back to the really basics and fundamentals of what it means to be made in the image of God. We need, of course, John Paul II gave the Catholic Church the theology of the body. And I'm not Roman Catholic for all kinds of theological reasons, but we need something like that, and there's not enough, and it certainly hasn't crept down. I mean, one could argue hasn't crept down among the laity in the Roman Catholic Church as well, but it certainly hasn't shaped us. And there's no way to not be deceived going into the next 30, 40, 50, 60 years if you aren't solid on what it means to be human. So do a creational theology, folks. That's just
true to the mission of the Colson Center and Breakpoint. You have answered the question so clearly and so directly and provided some real tangible considerations for parents. Thank you. I hate to stop now, but we're out of time. In fact, we're over time, but that's okay too. Folks,
I have that condition.
we have had John Stonestreet from the Colson Center and Breakpoint with us. Thank you again for joining us on Veritas Vox, the voice of classical Christian education.